Hello student, I am here Professor Smita Jha to discuss Victorian epic under the umbrella term or topic for the course Victorian novels and literature. Well, Victorian age is supposed to be a very rich age from the literature point of view. Very important role to make Victorian age one of the most rich age, literary traditional age in that way. So let us discuss what is there in Victorian epics. So epics in history has always occupied a prominent position as the highest test of poetic genius. Yet any poet imprudent enough to attempt an epic would be faced with a daunting challenge. For a Victorian poet, the attempt to rival Homer or Virgil involved complex considerations of form, theme, and history. The genre was traditionally associated with heroism and masculine strength, mythology, and the shaping of national identity, religion, and war. And with the poet's own desire to compete with and surpass his predecessors, much as epic heroes seek to prove their own supremacy. The reception of ancient epic was an ongoing concern in the period, since Homer in particular was cited as a model in literature, politics, and morality. Several significant poets of 19th century England discuss the epic genre in their verse, not allusively or intertextually, but directly and explicitly. We see Byron, Tennyson, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning doing this. Arnold discussed epic in his prose, and his Sohrab and Rustam is so saturated in Homer that the essays on the modern element in literature and on translating Homer almost seem to be continuing by other means a debate which the poem initiates. Keats in his own person, Clough in the person of Dipsychus, and Peter's fictional poet Flavian all declared a contrast between themselves and Homer. If the 19th century is not an age of great epic, it is at least a great age for observing epic's interactions. Matthew Arnold's prescriptions for translating Homer conveyed a sense of the responsibility involved in disseminating classical text to a new readership. The Iliad was appropriated in debates on divorce, masculinity, authorship, and the historical criticism of the Bible. The Odyssey offered an alternative novelistic version of Homeric epic, one which prioritized domesticity and highlighted the poem's female character. Some of the most influential Victorian creative responses to the epic tradition were not poems in 12 or 24 books, but verse novels, dramatic monologues, or theatrical burlesques. Others took up the challenge of writing at epic length and addressing national concern. For aspiring epic poets, there were many choices to be made. Should poetry inhabit a mythological world Whether Arthurian, Tennyson's Idylls of the King, or Swinburne's Tristram of Lyonesse, or Norse, William Morris' Sigurd the Volsung, or a contemporary domain like that of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. Might the epic be used to intervene in religious controversies or political conflicts, such as Chartism? Could a modern poet be the Virgil of the British Empire? Some of the most influential Victorian creative responses to the epic tradition were not poems in 12 or 20. Facing a strong competition from the novel, ambitious Victorian poets chose to approach such questions and an astonishing range of themes in a form which evoked vast expanses of time and space, extraordinary physical and intellectual achievement, and literary renown. Yet, to achieve recognition as an epic poet remains an unusual distinction. Despite recent critical attention to the proliferation of Victorian poems with epic aspirations, a small number of poems by Tennyson, Barrett Browning, and William Morris have continued to dominate accounts of the genre. A scholarly interest in epic as a genre is a comparatively recent phenomenon in Victorian studies, challenging earlier assumption that Paradise Lost represents an end point for the English epic. Donald Forrester surveys the reception of epic in the Victorian period, citing numerous statements by poets and critics. Herbert Tucker gives an insightful introduction to the prevalence of epic in the Victorian period, drawing attention to numerous minor epics as well as familiar examples. Adam Roberts is a useful point of reference for epics and other long poems of the period. Meanwhile, Adeline John Potter explores an important issue in accounts of the genre, the relationship between the epic and the novel. Colleen Graham and Simon Dennett address the idea of epic as a form associated with nationalism and imperialism. Tucker is unrivaled as a rigorously researched and engaging account of the diverse epic aspirations of Victorian poets. Buckland and Vanin Sakya are scholars who have a collection of essays responding to a revival of interest in the epic, which is informed by Tucker. A literary tradition is generally looked upon as a periodic or national group of literary works that share specific commonalities such as of form, themes, subject matter, ethos, or worldview. However, this can become too unfair a generalization since a literary tradition is also the collective totality of individuality of each poet of that tradition. The Victorian era, spanning roughly from 1830 to 1900, was characterized by unprecedented social, economic, and conceptual change, amassing of great wealth and ironically a greater social inequality between rich and poor. As a result, the level of social consciousness among the Victorian writers was higher than in any previous tradition, and rather than seeking refuge in fantasy or nature as seen in Romantic era, they choose to directly address the contemporary social problems. In this era, the novel gained prominence over poetry, which was a reversal of the situation in the previous literary tradition of romantics. However, the major poets of the era, such as Lord Tennyson, Gerald M. Hopkins, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Robert Browning, and Christina Rossetti, were as popular as its novelists. Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, Jane Austen, and Bronte sisters. One of the main formal features in Victorian poetry was their lengthy poetic structure, often in the form of long monologues. References to classical and historical figures in these monologues bring out a certain sense of nostalgia for the glorious past and the Victorian dilemma of attachment to the past, an inevitable movement towards the new century. Also, a sense of gloom and loss of purpose and meaning in life often pervades their poetry. Despite these similarities, the Victorian poetic tradition also reflects the unique voice of each poet and their own perception of the contemporary society. The poetry of the poet laureate Lord Tennyson, for instance, discusses a wide array of themes covering political, social, historical, and even personal issues. His widely acclaimed works such as The Lady of Shalott and Idylls of the King represent and glorify the medieval England, while Ulysses, The Lotus Eaters, and Ode to Virgil bear direct allusions to the classics Odyssey and Aeneid. His popular collection of poems In Memoriam, dedicated to his deceased friend A.H. Hallam, is an instance that shows how he can explore his own emotions and experiences in poetry. While in the Charge of the Light Brigade, he addresses social issues of war and repercussions of irresponsible political decisions. Thus, it can be seen how he attended to all the aspects of the society through his poetry. However, amidst this wide variety of subject matters, one can detect the singular poetic style and voice of Lord Tennyson. According to Carter and Macri, his poetry often consists of a polished poetic texture and a smooth, harmonious pattern of sound. And the note of despair and the sense of loss, doubt, anxiety, and resignation present in his poems show how Tennyson's emotion is recollected in regret rather than in Wordsworth's tranquility. These features can be observed in the poem Mariana, where the abandoned heroine is endlessly waiting for her lover, slowly going through decay. The following lines from the poem is an example. Then said she, I am very dreary. He will not come, she said. She wept, I am aweary, aweary, O God, that I were dead. This note of melancholy and gloom, which came to be one of the keynotes of Victorian poetry, was heightened by the motives of tragic death and isolation often found in his poetry. Tennyson also admired courage, heroism, and patriotism, which become major themes in poems such as Charge of the Light Brigade and Idylls of the King, bringing out a tone of nostalgic heroism. charge of the light brigade while criticizing the unwise judgment that brought about the death of many young soldiers. Also admires the bravery and heroism, though futile, of the noble 600 who rode into the jaws of death and mouth of hell against all odds. In Idylls of the King, which is based on the Arthurian legend, Tennyson idealizes King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and glorifies the heroism, chivalry, and grandeur of medieval England with a nostalgic note. This is in a way closer to the genre of the epic, exhibiting multiple characteristics of the original Greek ones. Hence, it can be said that it is one of the works that came the closest to the idea of a Victorian epic. Elizabeth Barrett Browning is another Victorian poet who established her own voice within the literary tradition of Victorian era by focusing on a different range of contemporary issues. As a female poet, a considerable part of her work was dedicated to voice the unjust treatment of women in the contemporary patriarchal society and to claim equal social status and freedom as men. Her poetry contributed largely to the emerging feminist movement of 19th century Victorian England. In Aurora Lay, which is one of her most renowned poems, she presents the life story of a woman writer who struggles against the social prejudices against women. Elizabeth Barrett Browning also voiced the contemporary political concern and issues of slavery. Her writing, in a certain way, is a practical application of her argument that women should be allowed a voice in political and social issues. Her poem, The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, presents a forceful criticism of slavery in America through the perspective of a black female slave. The Cry of the Children explores the issue of child abuse in mines and factories, while The Cry of the Human deals with the impact of corn law. Jem Hopkins is another unique poetic figure belonging to the Victorian literary tradition. In the aspects of both style and world view, his poetic vision marks such a strong development of the general Victorian ethos that he at times is classed as a modern or 20th century poet. According to Carter and Macrae, Victorian poetry moves progressively closer to despair during the century, coming by the time of Hopkins and Hardy to a sense of gloom which anticipates much of the desperation of the early 20th century. Thus, poetry of Hopkins can be regarded more or less the mark of transition from Victorian to modernist literary tradition. Hopkins' innovative formal structures, especially concerning sprung rhythm, and also his theories regarding inscape heighten the uniqueness of his poetry against the average Victorian tradition. In Hopkins' poetry, inscape means the unified complex of characteristics that gives each thing its uniqueness and that differentiate it from other things. For instance, in Pied Beauty, Hopkins praises God in creating every object, especially the ones that one may not find beautiful at first glance, saying, "Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, For rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim. He fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Here it can be observed how the concept of inscape, which concerned the essence of elements, often pointed to the design of God. Hopkins is also well known for his grammatical and syntactical inventiveness and also the experiments with rhythm and rhyme, especially regarding sprung rhythm. This can be observed in the poem The Wind Over. The beginning lines of the poem is as follows. I caught this morning, morning's minion king, dome of a daylight's dauphin, dappled down, drawn falcon in his riding. The rhythm, sound, and syntax of this poem is said to capture both the excited feelings of the poet and the movement of the bird in the air. G.M. Hopkins is known for his spiritual poems as well, often revealing the wilderness and emptiness within his own soul, and also speaking of the despair and human suffering in the contemporary society. However, the manner in which he deals with this gloominess is different from Tennyson. Carter and Macri, commenting on their poetry estate, says that that is Tennyson's, he is emotive rather than intellectual poetry, only naming the divine despair rather than investigating or challenging it. As Gerard Manley Hopkins was to do, while this shows the more critical approach of Hopkins towards social concerns. It also attests to the fact how two poets in the same tradition can speak of the same subject matter in two different voices. Matthew Arnold is a Victorian poet who speaks of the nothingness and meaninglessness of life in the contemporary society. His notable works include Dover Beach, A Scholar Gypsy, Empedocles on Etna, and the epic Balder Dead. His poem Dover Beach is known to summarize the general ethos of the Victorian society with its intensified visions of despair, loss of love and faith, gloom, negativity, and meaninglessness of human life. This is evident in the following lines that he writes in the poem. The world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light, nor certitude nor peace nor help for pain. However, Matthew Arnold was a poet with a highly humanitarian outlook who starts from social observation rather than philosophical reflection. This humanitarian trait is also observed in his ardent enthusiasm in bringing about educational reforms. Thus, he was also an important poet that decided the direction of Victorian poetry. It can thus be stated that it is unjust to identify the Victorian literary tradition as a mere metaphor of a compact set of text, even though it is generally a social commentary on one common society, bringing out its common ethos. Understanding the Victorian epic also becomes much easier when all these factors are taken into account. This contrast between the tone of resignation in Tennyson, the feminist and rather rebellious stance of Elizabeth Browning, the intellectual and critical perspective of Hopkins, and the humanitarian outlook of Arnold brings out how the voice of each poet is different from one another, despite the fact they address the issues of the same society. This difference of voices can perhaps be attributed to the different aspects of the rapidly changing society that occupied their poetic vision. Tennyson, History and the Past, Browning, Female Liberation, Hopkins, Crisis of Faith, and Arnold, Materialism and its dehumanizing effect. Thus, it is apparent that a literary tradition, rather than being a metaphor of a compact set of text, is in fact a meandering confluences of many cultural traditions and voices. On studying more about these writers, it can be seen that Tennyson was proclaimed as the English Virgil. Even in his lifetime, especially in John Cotton Collins' illustration of Tennyson 1891. Collins, a pioneer of the academic study of English literature in the UK, was allegedly described by Tennyson himself as a louse on the locks of literature, but the first chapter of his study contains some sensitive and insightful remarks on the similarities of Tennyson and Virgil. These remarks were tempered by some trace of traditional Victorian prejudice against Virgil's as an artificial poet, honored mainly for his style. Collins presented the two poets as essentially imitative and reflective. With both of them, expression is the first consideration. Tennyson's own view of Virgil presented in the poem commissioned by the people of Mantua for 1900 anniversary of the poet's death in 1882 supports Collins' thesis of a fundamental similarity between the two writers. The poem's 10 stanzas treat Virgil's works in reverse chronological and hierarchical order, beginning with the imperial themes of the Aeneid in the first stanza, but moving on swiftly in the second and third to the Virgil of the Georgics as landscape lover, lord of language, combining appreciation of Virgil as nature poet with praise of his polished and dense poetic technique, both aspects which have been noted as important for Tennyson himself. During the Victorian period, long-held religious beliefs fell under great doubt. An early blow to these beliefs came from utilitarian followers of Jeremy Bentham in the form of a test by reason of many of the longest-standing institutions of England, including the church. When seen through the eyes of reason, religion became merely an outmoded superstition. God seemed to be dissolving before a panicked England's very eyes, replaced by the vision of a cold, mechanistic universe that cared little for our existence. Alfred Lord Tennyson was painfully aware of the implications of such a universe, and he struggled with his own doubts about the existence of God. We glimpse much of his struggle in the poem In Memoriam, A.H.H., written in memory of deceased friend Arthur Hallam. The poem seemed to be cathartic for Tennyson, for through its writing, he not only found an outlet for his grief over Hallam's death, but also managed to regain the faith which seemed at times to have abandoned him. Tennyson regained and firmly re-established his faith through the formation of the idea that God is reconciled with the mechanistic universe through a divine plan of evolution, with Hallam as the potential link to a greater race of humans yet to come. In the first of many lyric units, Tennyson's faith in God and Jesus seems strong. He speaks of believing where we cannot prove and is sure that God will not leave us in the dust. The increasing threat posed to religion by science does not worry Tennyson here, as he believed that our increasing knowledge of the universe can be reconciled with faith. He writes in the poem, "Let knowledge grow from more to more, but more of reverence in us dwell, that mind and soul according well may make one music as before." Tennyson's mourning for the friend Arthur Henry Hallam and his compilation in Memoriam was not to show his mastery over discourse of reason, but to challenge to notion of reason and rationality formed during the age of enlightenment in Europe. The poem contains elaborate religious imagery on Christian themes of redemption of the soul and salvation. To enhance the effect of religious imagery, Tennyson introduces metaphysical elements in his poem. The poem is divided in 1-3-1 cantos and a prologue and epilogue. But when it is considered as a whole, there is almost a conscious attempt to move against the prevalent flow of scientific and rational thought process. The thought process of Tennyson in the poem is primarily propelled by his intense grief he feels for his friend. The tone of soul searching in the poem arises from that sense of grief. As the poet himself suggested, an alternate title for In Memoriam known as The Way of the Soul, the poet's soul searches for its way out of the grief and anguish through fears and lingering doubts to his salvation and his spiritual bliss with his departed friend. Thus, Victorian poetry and its associations. Asking in 1833 essays, "What is poetry?" the philosopher John Stuart Mill responded with term pilfered from drama, poetry is feeling, confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude. All poetry is of the nature of soliloquy, in the era's most heralded poetic innovation. Alfred Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning hybridized drama, fiction, and lyric into the dramatic monologue form. In their works, a poet impersonates a fictional or historical character and addresses a silent audience without any narrative framing or guidance. Visually minded poets, including the poet painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti and the writer designer William Morris, both associated with the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, pushed poetry towards the picturesque, relishing pictorial detail and painterly embellishment. Tennyson, Algernon Charles Swinburne, and G.M. Hopkins wrote lyrically lush poems that aspired towards music, delighting in mesmerizing meter such as Hopkins' invention sprung rhythm and virtuosic braids of alliteration and rhyme. Thus, they can be considered to be central pillars of what is now considered to be the Victorian epic. With this, I wrap up the discussion on Victorian epic. Let us meet next time in the lecture where I can give you something about the background of Victorian poetry. Thank you.